And what's the life goal of a monk? Like, who are monks? What are they trying to achieve?
So monks are trying to achieve nirvana or enlightenment, um, and they are not trying to achieve it in this life. So this is why you see them not being in a hurry to achieve nirvana, because they know that it's most probably not coming in this life, right? So and they are working towards hundreds, if not thousands, of lifetimes to achieve nirvana or Buddhahood. Um, the concept of nirvana, or maybe we can talk a little bit about this now. So you have to understand the Buddha's life before you can talk about nirvana. So the Buddha became an ascetic at the age of 29 after being a prince all his life. He became an ascetic and decided to go wander and see the truth of life. And after 6 years of wandering, the story goes that he decided to, and during these 6 years, he tried multiple spiritual practices like self harm and starvation and all difficult spiritual practices that he thought were helping him kind of realize what life is. And then the story goes that he meditated under a Bodhi tree and then he reached enlightenment. Enlightenment in the sense that he came to know the truth of life. And in his first discourse, what is called as the discourse on the turning of the wheel of the Dharma, which is the first lecture or first discourse or first sermon that the Buddha gave to the people that he was speaking to during the 6 years. He went back to them and he told them, I found the purpose of life in a sense, or I found the answer. And he said that I found, that is what we call now as the Four Noble Truths. He said there are four truths. The first truth, he said, is that it's called the truth of dukkha, or the truth of suffering. Now you can see lots of mistranslation these days of the word dukkha or suffering. Many public intellectuals translate this as life is suffering. However, this is not what the Buddha meant. The truth of dukkha, or the truth of suffering, means in this life there is inevitable suffering. And the word suffering can also be expanded to include frustration and mental agitation. Not necessarily suffering in the sense, because when you say suffering to a Christian audience, they will feel that suffering is just like the suffering of Jesus on the cross. However, this is not what the Buddha meant. He meant mental agitation, frustration, dissatisfaction, and physical suffering. Because if you just read what he said afterwards, he said, birth is suffering, death is suffering, attachment to something you don't like is suffering, detachment from something you like is suffering.
Wow.
So he gave it a kind of more expanded meaning. So that was the first truth, just very quickly, the truth of suffering. Then he said the second truth is that he knows that this suffering is due to attachment and desire. And he knows that this is why we have this. When we have expectations, when we have a certain attachment, we get in return, we get the suffering or mental agitation or dissatisfaction. And then he said the third truth is that there is a way to overcome this. Now, in formal traditional Buddhist books, they call it cessation of suffering.
Okay.
Modern Buddhists, modern monks, they like to call it happiness. Because they're saying, cessation of suffering is the same thing as happiness. I tend to disagree. I think if the Buddha wanted to say happiness, he would have said happiness, right? So I don't think this is I don't think he wanted to say happiness, but I think in the hope of making Buddhism sound more trendy or more secular, let's say, to a Western audience or to a modern audience, they like to say, the Buddha meant happiness. I don't think so.
But why do you don't think so?
Because first of all, if he wanted to say that, he would have said that. Number two, a cessation of suffering is not the same as happiness. The Buddha does not promise. He is not saying that he found he found the cure to happiness, or he found the reason for happiness. Even the Dalai Lama, if you read his book, sometimes he says the Buddhists believe in that the purpose of life is happiness. I'm not sure about this concept. I feel that The cessation of suffering means the Buddha has found the cure for stopping this mental agitation, frustration, and dissatisfaction. And this is the third truth. And then he says how he kind of came up with the system. The fourth truth is the concept of the Eightfold Path, the eight steps that a committed Buddhist has to follow in the path of the Buddha in order to achieve nirvana and to achieve nirvana and to end the suffering, not necessarily to attain happiness.